Peters held up the chart on the dais. 90% of Republican state disaster requests approved, 23% for Democratic states. No president has done that since FEMA was created. The nominee dodged. Let's watch.
Under President Trump's second administration, nearly 90% of Republican states' disaster assistance requests have been approved. That compares to only 23% of Democratic states' requests. Since the establishment of FEMA, and let me highlight, no other president has created such a disparity in states that receive federal disaster aid. Denying over 75% of requests from states that are led by representatives of another party is unconscionable. We have a chart here. I'll just show you the chart here, which is pretty stark data. Pretty stark data from Trump. Stand up, please. High Republican states, boom, a collapse in Democratic states. Given this stark data, what other conclusions can one draw other than the president is using federal disaster assistance to punish states that elect Democrats? So my question for you, sir, is does disaster survivor in a blue state deserve less support than a survivor in a red state?
Senator, thank you for your question. What I can tell you is I care deeply for survivors, and I believe the president does as well. I believe all survivors who have faced high consequence events deserve the proper care, support, and resources of the United States government brought to bear.
So how do you explain this discrepancy here?
Well, Senator, I certainly appreciate your concern. What I can tell you is that if confirmed, my focus will be to ensure that FEMA is objective, is fair and reasonable, follows the law, and is consistent in the approach to be how we adjudicate and process claims and requests for disasters.
Well, I'm going to cut back to that, but I would just want to say, I seem to recall my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here were absolutely incensed by several instances during President Biden's tenure where FEMA representatives skipped houses with Trump signs. I called that out as well. I thought that was unaccountable. I'm on the record condemning that. My Republican colleagues were condemning that. And now that the federal government is deciding not to skip a few homes, but entire states, I would hope my colleagues would join me with that outrage that they had when a few houses were skipped. I hope that comes. I hope we hear that today. But it's concerning to your point about doing something different, which I hope that's the case. But you were involved in this process for 5 months last year and are now back at DHS now, but you still can't answer questions about what happened while you were there, why this huge cliff of Democratic states being denied disaster assistance, survivors being denied disaster assistance. So I'm not satisfied with that answer. I don't trust that that's what you're going to do because it didn't seem like you did it when you were there before or were not involved in it or don't now talk about it. And I certainly hope that we get further explanations as how you're going to go forward and certainly Mr. Duncan as well. I'll be asking for information regarding this written. Mr. Duncan, as we discussed yesterday, OMB is refusing to cooperate with at least 14 GAO audits, including 10 audits required by law, you're ignoring them, and 4 audits that I requested as the ranking member of HISGAC. As I hope you know, GAO is Congress's independent, nonpartisan watchdog. Now, I know that drives this administration crazy to have a watchdog, especially if they're independent. They're used to people standing around them just rubber stamping whatever they do. But these are independent watchdogs. And their work has literally saved billions in taxpayer money from fraud, for abuse. And you're ignoring those. OMB is ignoring them. Will you commit without reservation to full cooperation with every GAO audit?
Senator, I appreciate the question, and I appreciated the opportunity to meet with you and your team yesterday. We have received that list of audits that your team flagged for us last night. I sent it to our team this morning, first thing, and asked them to review. We're going to have a conversation about those specific audits right after this hearing. As it relates to inquiries we get from GAO, I would note that GAO has 7 times the number of employees that OMB does. At one point, we had 50 open inquiries from GAO mid last year. We try to respond to GAO inquiries in a responsible time while we're able to, still maintaining our ability to carry out our duties in support of the administration. I certainly commit to being apprised of every GAO request and discussing next steps with counsel. And and understand the importance of the responses to the audits that you flagged for me yesterday and the responses there as well.
Well, I hope you will be. I appreciate that you will do that. I look forward to your quick response. I appreciate you mentioning the resources GAO has. They have it for a reason, because they actually save billions of dollars. And as I recall, Congress has given OMB $100 million in the big, beautiful bill. So there are plenty of resources in your department. And if you could dedicate some of those to independent oversight and actually save billions of dollars in taxpayer money, I would certainly welcome that. We hope to see that if you're confirmed.
What made this Peters exchange travel was the data itself. Senator Gary Peters of Michigan opened with 2 numbers. Under the second Trump administration, nearly 90% of disaster assistance requests from Republican states have been approved. 23% of requests from Democratic states have been approved. He held up the chart on the dais. Republican states up, Democratic states down. Peters said since the establishment of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, no other president has created such a disparity in which states receive federal disaster aid. The numbers landed because they are independently checkable. Peters cited approval rates that committee staff and outside reporters can reproduce from the FEMA Disaster Declarations database. The disparity is not a marginal statistical artifact. It is a gap large enough to show up cleanly in any aggregation that breaks down approval rates by the partisan composition of the requesting governor's office. That is why Peters elected to lead with the chart rather than with a narrative argument. The institutional claim Peters made is worth slowing down on. FEMA has been operating since 1979, when President Carter consolidated emergency response functions into a single agency. Since then, the agency has operated under administrations of both parties. There have been periods of dispute over individual disaster declarations. There have been periods of slow response. There has not been, in the published record, a sustained pattern of partisan disparity in approval rates at the scale Peters identified. The lack of historical precedent is the strongest evidence in his argument. State emergency management directors in several Democratic states have begun publicly noting a change in their interactions with FEMA. The pattern I describe is not refusal in principle. It is delay, partial denial, and elevated documentation requirements. Some requests that would have been approved in a routine cycle now face multi-week review. Others come back with reduced funding ceilings. The accumulated effect is the cliff Peters showed on his chart. The reporting suggests the change began roughly 5 months ago. During the window, the nominee himself acknowledged having been involved at DHS. Peters then made the human reframing. His question to the nominee was structurally simple. Does a disaster survivor in a blue state deserve less support than a survivor in a red state? The question is rhetorical, but it forces the nominee to either commit to the principle of equal treatment or to defend the existing pattern. Either answer becomes part of the confirmation record. The nominee chose the former, saying he cares deeply for survivors and that the president does as well. The framing matters because Peters had now moved the conversation from procedural disparity to the survivors who bear the conversation from procedural disparity to the survivors who bear the cost. The legal framework underneath disaster declarations is the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, codified at Title 42, United States Code, Section 5170 and following. The Stafford Act sets out a process. A governor requests a declaration. FEMA conducts a preliminary damage assessment. The president signs or declines the declaration. The Act gives the executive branch discretion in how to weigh damage assessments and resource availability. The Act does not contemplate partisan composition as a permitted input to the analysis. That is the structural problem Peters was naming. Peters then turned to the nominee's recent history. The nominee had served at the Department of Homeland Security for 5 months during the relevant window. He is back at DHS now in his current capacity. Peters asked him to explain the disparity in disaster aid approvals during that window. The nominee declined to engage the specifics. He committed to be objective, fair, reasonable, and consistent if confirmed. Peters noted that the nominee had been involved in the process during the window in question and could not now answer questions about what happened then. Peters used the word trust and said he did not trust the commitment going forward because it did not appear to be present in the prior conduct. Public personnel records, available through the federal government's Plum Book and the official DHS organizational charts, confirm the nominee's tenure at the department during the window Peters cited. The records show the nominee held a senior role in the policy chain that handles emergency declarations during that period. Whether the nominee personally made specific approval decisions is a separate question, but the institutional position was within the chain that did. That overlap is what made Peters' question so structurally difficult to dodge. Peters then drew a parallel that gives the exchange its rhetorical force. Several years earlier, FEMA representatives in one community had skipped a small number of houses that displayed Trump signs. The incident generated bipartisan outrage. Republican members of Congress condemned the conduct. Democrats, including Peters, also condemned it. Peters said he is on the record condemning it. The contrast he then drew was direct. Then a handful of houses were skipped, and the response was outrage. Now entire states are being skipped, and the response from his Republican colleagues has been silence. He invited them to join him in the same outrage they had shown before. The reporting on the prior FEMA worker incident is extensive. Public statements from Republican members of Congress at the time used language identical to what Peters now uses to describe the current pattern. The structural parallel is exact. The difference is that the prior incident involved individual workers in the field. The current pattern is policy at the agency level, originating from headquarters. The escalation, in Peters' framing, makes the absence of outrage harder to explain. The administrative law question underneath the exchange is about the limits of executive discretion. The Stafford Act gives the executive branch latitude in evaluating disaster declarations. That latitude exists to allow case-by-case judgment based on damage severity, state response capacity, and federal resource availability. The latitude is not unlimited. The arbitrary and capricious standard from the Administrative Procedure Act limits how the discretion can be exercised. A consistent partisan pattern of approval and denial, if proven, would likely fail the arbitrary and capricious test in federal court. Several Democratic state attorneys general are reportedly evaluating litigation. The reason this matters beyond confirmation hearing theater is straightforward. Disaster aid timing is the difference between whether a household recovers in 12 months or in 5 years. Delayed approvals push households into deeper financial distress. Partial denials force state and local governments to absorb shortfalls. Survivors in delayed states experience the cost as a real impact on their housing, their employment, and their family stability. The disparity Peters identified, if sustained, is not an abstract administrative problem. It is a measurable difference in outcomes for survivors based on the state where theater disaster happened. Academic research on disaster recovery, going back to studies of Hurricane Katrina and through more recent work on Hurricane Harvey and the western wildfires, consistently finds that the speed of federal disaster aid is the single largest predictor of long-term household recovery. Households that receive timely aid recover within 12 to 18 months in most categories. Households that face delays of 6 months or more often do not fully recover for 3 to 5 years. That research is published in the peer-reviewed disaster recovery literature. What the Budget Committee will do with this exchange is mechanical. The data Peters placed in the record is now part of the formal confirmation file. The nominee's commitment to be objective, fair, reasonable, and consistent if confirmed is also in the record. The committee will hold a vote. The vote will be reported to the full Senate. The full Senate will hold a floor vote. Senators will weigh the substantive case for the nominee against the record on the disparity. Each senator will reach their own conclusion. The vote will reflect that aggregation. State attorneys' general offices in several Democratic states are reportedly preparing administrative challenges. The most likely legal theory is an Administrative Procedure Act claim, arguing that the pattern of approvals and denials reflects arbitrary and capricious agency action. The threshold for that claim is high, but achievable when the statistical evidence is clean. Peters' chart, if reproducible from FEMA's own data, would form the evidentiary core of any such filing. The litigation, if it proceeds, would test the limits of executive discretion under the Stafford Act in a way the courts have not previously had to address. What is unusual about this exchange, structurally, is what the nominee chose not to do. He could have offered a defense of the prior period's approval pattern. He could have argued that the apparent disparity reflects underlying differences in damage severity, state preparedness, or resource constraints rather than partisan bias. He could have asked the committee for the underlying claim-level data to make the case. He did none of those things. He pivoted to forward-looking commitments. That choice is itself a signal. Defenses that exist tend to be made when they would help. The FEMA policy manual published on the agency's official website lays out the declaration process step by step. A governor's request triggers a preliminary damage assessment conducted by a joint state and federal team. The team produces a quantitative assessment of damage against the per capita impact threshold and the cumulative impact threshold. The recommendation moves through FEMA leadership, then to the Secretary of Homeland Security, then to the President for signature or denial. At each step, the criteria are denial. That documentation is what would form the evidentiary basis for any legal challenge to a pattern of disparate treatment. Peters' framing throughout the exchange is worth noting. He was not asking for preferential treatment for Democratic states. He was asking for the same treatment Republican states are receiving. He was not asking the nominee to commit to a specific approval rate. He was asking the nominee to commit to applying the Stafford Act consistently across the partisan composition of state government. He was not asking for a defense of the prior period. He was asking for an explanation. The framing makes the exchange harder to dismiss as partisan theater. It is a request for equal application of an existing law. The phrase Peters used, captured by reporters in the committee room, is likely to be the headline that travels. Disaster survivors are not a party. The framing positions the question as a civil rights question rather than a partisan procedural question. That framing has implications for how the next round of state attorneys general filings will be structured. It also has implications for how news coverage will describe the exchange in the days following the hearing. The framing decision is part of the procedural craft of an experienced senator on a confirmation hearing. So the final accountability question is the standard one. What was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? What the public gained is a clean numerical record of an unprecedented pattern in federal disaster aid administration, placed on the record by the chairman of the Budget Committee. What the nominee gained is a forward-looking commitment in the record that may help him with confirmation. What was lost was the chance to hear a substantive explanation of the prior period. The cost is paid by disaster survivors in the affected states whose recovery is being slowed. The committee can decide. The full Senate can decide. The public can decide what was lost and to help him if FEMA wants administering the Stafford Act.